So I get this question quite often. How long will it take for me to get good at playing jazz? So today what I want to talk about is how to get good at playing jazz in 1 year, okay? How to get good at playing jazz in 1 year, because as we'll talk about in a second, it's important that we define what that actually means. I'm gonna give an exact plan of what I would do to get good at playing jazz in 1 year. We're gonna break this down into 3 different parts. Number 1 is how much should you practice? Number 2 is what should you practice? And number 3 is how you should practice. In case you don't know who I am, my name is Brent Vaartstra. I am the jazz musician and educator behind LearnJazzStandards.com. We've helped hundreds of thousands of musicians all over the world learn how to play jazz. This is what I do. I've been doing this over 15 years. So excited today to share with you a little bit about how to get good in 1 year. Before we get started, I think it's really important to talk about what do I mean by good? We really have to define good. Like, what is a good jazz musician, or what would mean that you are a good jazz musician after 1 year? For me, there are 2 different ways to think about this, and I think both of them have to be in place to be considered good. The first one is personal. After 1 year, would you feel like you've tackled some of your big musical goals for jazz, right? So for example, perhaps your big goal was being able to play at a jazz jam session and feeling confident to go up and play a solo, and then play a solo that you actually thought sounded good, right? So to me, that would mean you're playing good, right? That is good playing if you're able to do that on a personal level. So a high degree of satisfaction with your own playing would be really important. Now, that does not mean that you feel like you've arrived by any stretch. It does not mean that you are the best player in the room. It does not mean that you're 100% satisfied with your solos. It just means that you have a degree of satisfaction and you can play pretty well as far as you personally are concerned, right? Because if we're talking about you being professional level or anything like that and able to play at that level, that's gonna take you longer than 1 year no matter what, okay? So that's important to talk about here. The other side is the outward look at your playing. Like, if I were to listen to your playing, or other musical peers were to listen to your playing, would they listen to you play and say, you sound good? Right? That would be really important to be defined as good. So for me personally, what that would look like is when you took a solo, I could hear authentic jazz language being played. I could hear you playing music that sounds like jazz, the way great jazz musicians would actually improvise. I would hear you being able to use some creativity in your playing, that you were developing at least somewhat of your own voice. I would also be able to hear that you know a decent number of songs, right? That you're not fazed by too many songs. You might not know them all, of course, no one does, but you would have a good repertoire underneath your belt and could navigate and improvise over all of those songs, or walk bass lines, or comp proficiently through those. Again, doesn't mean that you're doing it better than everybody else, or you're the most professional, or whatever. It just means that I could listen to you and be like, that's a good musician, that is a good jazz player, right? That's what I mean. So when it has the personal side and the outward, right, what other people think of your playing in place, that to me means you are a good jazz musician. Okay, so let's move on to how to get good at playing jazz in 1 year. And this would assume starting at a level of, not that you don't know how to play your instrument, but perhaps like you've dabbled in jazz before. Maybe you know 1 or 2 tunes, so it's not like you're completely starting from square one, although it's possible you could be, but you certainly already know how to play your instrument. If you don't know how to play your instrument well in the first place, this is not probably going to work, okay? But starting at this basic level of, can play your instrument well, you definitely know about jazz, you've been listening to jazz, so on and so forth. So number 1, how much should you be practicing to get good in 1 year? To get good in 1 year, you should be practicing a minimum of 1 hour per day. Now, I don't typically give this advice because I'm not generally talking about someone getting good in 1 year, because generally it is totally acceptable to not get good in 1 year, right? It can take longer than that, and it's totally fine for it to take longer than that. In many cases, it does take longer than that. If you don't have time to practice for 1 hour a day, that is completely fine. You can still improve your jazz playing and get satisfying results with less practice time, or even if you're not able to practice every day. But if you actually want to get good in 1 year and make quicker progress, a minimum of 1 hour a day is what I would require. And of course, built in there could be, oops, I got sick, I can't play. Oops, I'm going on vacation, I can't play. Sure, that's totally fine. But in general, making sure that you are spending at least 1 hour a day practicing. Now, even better would be 2 hours of practice a day, okay? If you could manage to practice for 2 hours per day, that would more so ensure that you're going to get good in 1 year. Because there is some truth there where with more practice time, you can get better faster at playing. This goes for really any skill, right? Or even any kind of music, but the longer that you have to dedicate to that practice, the more potential you have to improve, right? You know, it doesn't mean you will, but it just there's more potential to improve because you're exposing yourself more to the music, you're translating that music to your instrument more often, so you're more likely to improve if you spend a little bit more time practicing. Now, I, in general, wouldn't necessarily recommend spending too much more than 2 hours a day, honestly. In fact, I would say the maximum really should be 3 hours a day, and even 3 hours could possibly be pushing it for the average person. And the reason that is because in general, our attentions start waning pretty quickly after the 2 hour mark. And depending on who you are, it could wane before then. Some people have really good focus and really good engagement and aren't gonna get burnt out so easily. And so 3 hours could be possible for someone if they have the time to do it. But I would say in general, 2 hours would be like an ideal. 1 hour would be a minimum. 3 hours would be like, don't go over 3 hours. But if we're talking about in that kind of time frame on a daily basis, then you're gonna get good in 1 year. It's important to mention here the obvious. Consistency is far more important than numbers of hours practiced in a week, right? So for example, if you only practice twice a week, but still spent the same amount of hours practicing, that is not near as valuable as practicing every single day for whatever amount of time that you have to practice. There's science to back this up, right? We learn best using spaced repetition, for example, meaning we learn something, we put some space in between it, and then we relearn it again, or we remind ourselves of it again. And the more that we do this, the more long-term memory builds up in our brain. And of course, also the less likely we are to get burnt out. So I think this is super important when we're talking about practicing. The consistency of the practice and the frequency really of the practice, I think is a lot more important than the total amount of practice. Okay. And it's especially important if you're talking about getting good in 1 year, is that you are extremely consistent and diligent about your practice schedule, that you are spending time with the instrument every day, that you are spending time with the music every single day. That's really, really important. So let's move on to number 2. What should you practice? Okay, let's talk about it all. So let's start first and get the super obvious one right out of the way. There should be passive listening happening all of the time if you're gonna get good in 1 year, which means that you're just listening to jazz music all of the time, okay? As much as you can. It doesn't have to be all of the time, but just frequently, right? You're listening to jazz music. And passive listening being, it's not that you're really necessarily focusing on it or trying to learn from it, although you could be, but it's just about having it around you so that you're getting the sounds and you're getting the inspiration from the great musicians just surrounding you. You're immersed in the language of jazz, okay? So that should just be happening on in the background if we're trying to do this thing in 1 year, okay? Number 2 would be to pick 24 songs, 24 jazz standards that you will learn over the course of this period of time, okay? 24 jazz standards that you will learn over the course of 1 year. Now, generally, I actually recommend learning just 12 jazz standards a year, and because, again, the 1 year time frame isn't quite so important. Generally speaking, I actually would say that learning 1 jazz standard a month, a new one that is actually probably a more optimal idea than learning 24, than learning 2 a month. In fact, that's what we do in our Learn Jazz Standards Inner Circle membership. We learn 1 a month. But again, we're talking about 1 year, so a little bit more of an intensive year that you're spending here. And the reason why you want to learn 2 a month versus 1 a month, like I would normally recommend, is because, like I said, one of the prerequisites for you being good is that you have to have a decent repertoire of tunes. And in this case, you're gonna have to learn some lessons a little bit faster, which means you should probably be exposed to some more songs than I would normally recommend, okay? Pick 24 jazz standards that you will learn and map them out, the 2 that you will learn every single month of the year, so that you're very clear about what those songs are and when you will learn those songs. That way that you have a schedule, you're not flying blind, you actually have a real plan for learning these songs. Now, you will want to regularly review all of these songs and spend practice sessions reviewing these songs throughout the year that you're working on these songs. But that being said, each month you'll really just be focusing mostly on the 2 new songs that you are learning. Every month you should have at least one thing that is technically specific to your instrument that you're focusing on every single month, okay? And that will be different things for different instruments. If you're a guitar player like me, you might be working on drop 2 voicings, you might be working on being able to play scales all over your entire fretboard, you might be working on playing arpeggios and chord tones. If you're a piano player, you're working on your voicings and doing all sorts of things like that. But I would focus on at least one technical aspect of playing your instrument as it pertains to jazz specifically, right? Not just random stuff, but even better if you can take that technical thing and apply it to the jazz standard you're learning. So for example, like learning the drop 2 voicings on my guitar is a good idea, and doing that just as a separate exercise is a good idea. But even better if I can learn how to apply those voicings to the standard that I am learning, okay? That's way more effective than just learning those things separately, or even practicing scales in the context of jazz standards as a technical exercise, or arpeggios. That's a great idea, applying everything to the jazz standard versus just by itself. I'm really looking at the instrument I play, the technical deficiencies I currently have, or the things that I'm just not able to do, and I'm actually going out and I'm trying to work on these jazz standards. Now, it's a good idea if you're very new to jazz improvisation that you're really thinking about jazz improv specific technical exercises. The best example I can give of this is chord tone exercises. So one thing is, if you're not used to improvising over chord changes in jazz standards, working on chord tones is a good idea. That's one resource we actually provide in our Inner Circle membership on our jazz standard studies, is we provide chord tone maps, which use voice leading to connect chord tones together. We do this because it's kind of a technical foundation for starting to improvise, and it's a good thing for you to do on your instrument as well. So you might want to also consider that in conjunction to stuff that is very instrument specific. Now, the third thing I would be doing in practicing is I would be learning jazz language every single month, and preferably every single week, and probably at least for multiple of your practice sessions every single week. So what does that mean by learning jazz language? So that could come in a few different forms, right? It could come in the form of, you're learning an entire chorus of a jazz solo over top of one of the songs that you're learning in the month. Ideally, learning one chorus for each one of the songs that you're learning would be a good idea. You don't necessarily need to do more than one chorus, in my opinion. That's perfectly fine. That could be from learning stuff off of a record and getting it on your instrument if you're good at that already. That could be from reading an etude, like we provide in our Inner Circle membership, like reading an etude, it's a composed jazz solo, and then memorizing it. That could be one way to go about it. It could also be more micro jazz language ideas too. You will probably come across a realization after a while that, oh, hey, there's a lot of 2-5-1 chord progressions in jazz standards that I'm learning, but I need to get good at improvising over 2-5-1 chord progressions, okay? So what you're gonna wanna be doing there is learning licks, right? So you might learn a whole chorus of the solo over top of the jazz standard that you're learning, but then you might go, hey, there's this one chord progression here I need to work on, and I would be taking that lick, one lick from that solo you've learned, and I would refine it even more. I would take that lick into all 12 keys. I would maybe try composing my own versions of that lick, trying to make it my own thing versus what somebody else actually played. And so I'd be really focused a lot on jazz language every single month. Input activities, as we call them, versus just output activities, which would be improvising, which I'll talk about in a second. But really just focusing on that, focusing on learning lots of jazz language, getting that stuff in my ear, getting it on my instrument. Now, it's important to mention this, by the way, if you're away from your instrument, when you're not able to actually hold the instrument, and usually when I'm talking about these 1-hour practice sessions, I'm talking about with your instrument. Even outside of that, you can still be practicing the stuff. So for example, if you're learning the one chorus of a jazz solo, you could, while you're in the car or while you're exercising or whatever you're doing, be internalizing that, getting your headphones on and listening to that one chorus on loop over and over and over again, so that you are very familiar with that musical material before you even start putting it on your instrument or while you're putting it on your instrument, right? And that's more of that active listening side versus the passive listening I was talking about before. So you can be practicing actually away from your instrument and really actually increase the number of hours you're practicing every single day simply by doing this active listening activities where you're trying to ingrain a song that you've learned, ingrain the melody that you've learned, ingrain the solo that you're trying to learn, ingrain the lick that you're trying to learn. You can be doing that stuff even away from your instrument. So that's something that you probably should really consider doing in your free time while you're not actually sitting down with your instrument and trying to get the stuff on your instrument. And the fourth and final thing that you should be doing is improvising, okay? That might sound a little obvious. Jazz improvisation is really important. And the fact of the matter is you're not gonna get better at improvising simply by learning a bunch of jazz language and on your instrument. That's gonna give you sentences that you can say, or it's gonna give you an idea of the lay of the land, and it's gonna improve your language over time. But ultimately, you have to start trial and error, practicing improvising over the jazz standards that you're learning so that you can get better at, right? That's really what you need to be focused on doing, at least a little bit every single week, if not every single day. It's just spending a little bit of time improvising and allowing yourself to make as many mistakes as you want. It's totally fine, even just putting up a backing track, looping that song over and over again. And I'll talk in our next section here about how to practice a little bit more of strategies on this so that you can actually make more progress on your improvisation a little bit faster. But just spend time improvising, making mistakes, and realizing where the holes are in your playing is gonna be really important to start doing on day one so that you can start making pivots right away as you keep going along those weeks and those months towards 1 year. Okay, so that's what to practice. Let's talk about how to practice, because this is actually pretty crucial here. If your practicing is not good, you might severely be hurting your chances of actually being able to accomplish the goal of being good in 1 year, sounding good in 1 year, okay? So the first thing when we're talking about how to practice is please make sure you have the resources available to you to make this process easy, okay? If you don't have the resources available to you to make this process easy, you're simply adding friction in the way of you doing this. So you're taking up your practice time, you're making your practice time slower. Everything's gonna take longer to do if you just don't give yourself the necessary resources you need. So that would mean, hey, if I'm learning solos, like why not get transcriptions if that would help me read, right? Or why not plan out what all those are going to be for the year so that I don't have to think about what they are week after week, the solos that I'm gonna learn or the songs I'm gonna learn, right? So those sorts of things. If I need to work on certain aspects of my playing, why don't I have courses on guitar, jazz piano to work on voicings to get what I should actually be working on there? Why don't I have those available to me rather than wasting my time on YouTube or the internet trying to look up those things as I go along, right? Have high quality resources available to you. That would include practice tools like Slowdowners, right? Like Amazing Slowdowner or Transcribe or Songmaster to help you with your practicing, practice journals, any tools, technology that you think would be useful for you to make this process easier. I would highly recommend doing that and investing money in it. Investing in a jazz coach could be really helpful. That would all be things that I would recommend doing if you want to improve and succeed ultimately. So have those resources available to you right from the very beginning. Okay, with the resources thing put aside, before you start your practice sessions, make sure you know exactly what you're going to practice before you start. That way you're not wasting time thinking about what you should practice that exact same day, and you're not gonna be tempted to just start noodling and playing random stuff and get distracted, right? If you know exactly what you're gonna do, you're gonna be efficient, okay? And that's as much as I'm pretty much gonna say in the efficiency side. I'm not gonna go over like, hey, everyone turn off your phone or any of that stuff. I mean, you're smart enough to know, what creates a not very suitable environment for you to practice in. I'd rather not focus as much on that, but at the very least, know what you're going to practice before you start practicing it. When you're practicing, and you're learning new material, be careful not to do too much at once. This is really important. Don't try to learn too much of your solo at once. Don't try to learn too much of your song at once. Try to break it up into chunks because in general, our brain works best when we're not overwhelming it. And then, like I talked about earlier, we're utilizing spaced repetition. We're learning something and then we're the next day maybe, learning that part again or reminding ourselves of that part again and then learning a little bit more and then doing some review, right? So don't do too much at once, which goes into the second thing, which I kind of hinted at already here, is add lots of review constantly into your playing. If you're not reviewing what you're learning and what you're doing, it's not going to really be retained very well. And keep in mind that other than the songs themselves, right? The idea is not to retain the solos that you learn forever or retain the licks that you learn forever. It's more for the short-term memory that you want to retain those things, but you still want to get those things internalized enough that they have a chance to come out in your own natural playing. So we're looking for more short-term memory, not necessarily years of remembering these things. But the more that you treat it as small chunks with tons of review, that's gonna really help the learning process. When you're practicing improvising, this is really important. It is probably going to be a good idea many times to not simply focus on improvising over the entire song that you're working on, but rather smaller parts of the song, right? So for example, you might just take the first 4 bars of a song that you're learning and loop that, right? You could use a tool like any of the slowdowners, Amazing Slowdowner, Songmaster have looping capabilities, or if you have your own looper, you can do that with a backing track, for example, and just really focusing on smaller phrases, right? Especially if you're newer to jazz and you really have a lot of work to do to try to create good melodies and great stuff going on within those bars, then you want to break it down and treat each chord progression as its own improvisational practice, right? Experimenting, trying some of the licks you learned verbatim, composing some of your own licks, improvising some of your own licks, playing super simple ideas, trying to play cool beboppy eighth note ideas as you develop that language along the way, right? So over time, you can get better at playing entire songs if you focus on them in little chunks. So when you're practicing, consider that. Consider the different sections of the song that you might want to loop and focus on, rather than always just like improvising over the entire thing. When you're practicing throughout these months, be sure to be recording yourself regularly. I would at least recommend, at a very minimum, recording yourself once a month, if not once every 2 weeks. And the purpose of recording yourself, it's not even necessary to say, am I getting better or not? Although that's certainly one thing that you could be judging from there, but it's more so to do an evaluation of what you should be focusing on next. Because one thing with all the things I said with the what you should be practicing section, those in general are the things you should be working on. However, your learning journey is personal to you. You have certain strengths and weaknesses in your playing that you have to figure out what those are for yourself. Start spending more time focusing on some of those things that are personal to you. So what I'd recommend is record yourself just improvising over one of the songs you're working on. Don't do multiple takes, just do one take, because you're just trying to get a very honest assessment of what your playing is today. Listen to that recording and just make notes about the things that you really liked about it and the things that you didn't like about it. The things that you liked about your playing, really make a plan to double down on those, right? Oh, I like the way I jump intervals, or I like the way I do chord melody, or I like my rhythm feel, right? Okay, what are some strategies that you can practice that will help you improve those even more or get better at those, right? The things that you're already good at or the things that you already like, those probably have even more potential, right, than even the things that you're not good at doing, right? So spend lots of time practicing those things as well. And then the things that you don't like or that you're not good at, obviously you want to focus on those too. You want to go, hey, my rhythm isn't very good, or my time feel is pretty bad. Okay, how do we get better at doing that, right? So you work on getting better at doing that and picking some strategies that you can focus on for the next month or for the next 2 weeks, at improving at those, so that by the time you do your next recording, you've made some markable improvements by executing on some strategies. You record yourself again and you listen back and you write those lists out again, what I like, what I didn't like, and you make another plan for things that you should focus on. If you're actually continually doing that throughout the year and making progress on those things that you're good at and the things that you're not good at, you will probably improve quite a bit faster than if you're just sort of ignoring this whole process, right? And that's why the how you practice is probably one of the most important sections of this video, because if your practicing is not very good, then even if you're practicing all the right things, you're not going to be making near as much progress, and you're going to hurt your chances of getting good in 1 year significantly. Okay, and the last thing I'll say here goes a little bit outside of the 3 categories I just talked about, but is very much so related. It would be a very good idea for you to make a plan as soon as possible to start on a very regular basis playing with other musicians, playing jazz with other musicians. This could be as simple as finding one other person that you meet up with on a weekly basis, whether it be a jam session or you guys find yourself a little gig, or it could be something a little bit bigger, like you go to a public jazz jam session on a very regular basis and go out there and play. Because getting the real world playing experience is really invaluable when it comes to improving as an improviser, improving as a musician in general. So if you're able to start doing that, do that as soon as possible. And certainly consider engaging in some sort of community of other musicians who are practicing. That could be an online community like we have in our Inner Circle membership, or that could be just somewhere else, right? Find a community of other people doing the same thing. Try to meet up with some of them in person, or meetups with people in person that you know or that are in your town or city. This is also going to help improve your chances of getting good in 1 year. And then finally, how will you know if you have reached that goal, if you got good in 1 year? It kind of goes back to what I talked about at the very beginning of the video, which is number one, you're personally going to feel a degree of satisfaction with the way you play. You're going to be able to play at least 24 songs, right? And you're going to have a degree of confidence in improvising, right? And that can be considered good, absolutely. Again, doesn't mean that there's not room for improvement. It just means that you have reached a level of playing that you yourself feel is good. And then again, when others who look at you would say, hey, man, you play really good, or a coach or a teacher like me would say, hey, you play pretty good, right? Again, does not mean that you're the best or that there isn't room for improvement. Most certainly there will be, because no one can reach their musical potential in a year, if not 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or even 10 years, right? But that's just the ability of someone outside to say, hey, you are playing quite well. Now, ultimately, if at the end of this year, you're not able to say that about yourself, that I am good at playing jazz yet, what you should know is that is completely okay too. Because by going through a process like this, or even a process that's a lot easier or lighter than this, even half of what I just said to do, you will most certainly have improved and gotten closer to reaching your goals, and will be a lot happier with your playing than if you had not done these things otherwise. And please, again, keep in mind that this is not for everybody. You do not have to go and do something as near as intense as this. This is simply if you're someone who has this ambitious goal of getting good in 1 year. All right, my friends, if you are someone who wants some help with their jazz playing, do consider our Inner Circle membership. We have monthly jazz standard studies that we do there, as well as a library of many jazz standards that we've done, including etudes, including chord tone maps, including chords analysis, all the resources that you need that would really help you with this 1 year journey. As well as we have a community of thousands of other musicians playing all sorts of instruments, doing this thing together, and lots of jazz courses on pretty much any subject you need help with. So do check that out. I'll leave that in the link in the description, as well as here on the screen as well. If you like this video, give this a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.